Most of us know that the Soviet Union and the capitalist West would eventually become bitter enemies. But would you believe that, long before the Second World War, the Soviet Union had already engaged in deep economic cooperation with Western countries? When Stalin became the supreme leader of the Soviet Union, he inherited nothing less than a complete disaster. Beginning in 1853, Russia had suffered a series of humiliating defeats: the Crimean War, the Russo-Japanese War, and the First World War. Each defeat weakened the country further, turning Russia into what Lenin once called the weakest link in the chain of imperialism. At the same time, the civil war against the White Army had brought the domestic economy close to total collapse. The exchange rate of the ruble against the US dollar had once fallen from 2 rubles to $1 to as much as 1,200 rubles to $1. Industrial output after the war dropped to only 1/7 of its pre-war level, while agricultural output fell to roughly 1/3. In the cities, workers went on strike because of food shortages. Even the sailors of Kronstadt, who had once been loyal supporters of the Red Revolution during the days of October 1917, rose up against the Bolshevik government. The Soviet Union's external situation was no better. In 1927, after the Arcos affair, Britain broke off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, tore up trade agreements, and declared its intention to fight against the Communist International. In other words, the Soviet Union was facing economic collapse at home and hostility and isolation from capitalist powers abroad. It was under these conditions, surrounded by crisis both inside and outside the country, that Stalin would lead the Soviet Union down a path that remains deeply controversial to this day, a path that would bring extraordinary national strength in an extraordinarily short period of time. In Stalin's eyes, the gap between the Soviet Union and the developed Western countries was enormous. If the Soviet Union wanted to survive a future confrontation with the West, it had to move fast. He once warned, "We are 50 to 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it, or they crush us." Stalin said these words in 1931. Exactly 10 years later, in 1941, Nazi Germany invaded the Soviet Union. For Stalin, the first priority of Soviet development was national defense, and to build national defense, the Soviet Union had to build heavy industry. As he saw it, without heavy industry, the Soviet Union would lose the ability to produce modern weapons. But Stalin still had to answer one crucial question: where would the money for industrialization come from? Industrialization required enormous investment. Western countries had accumulated wealth through colonies, overseas trade, and capital markets. But the Soviet Union could not follow that path. So Stalin's answer was simple, brutal, and highly controversial: the price scissors between agriculture and industry, a planned economy, and forced state mobilization. The government would control prices. It would purchase agricultural products from peasants at low prices, then sell industrial goods back to them at higher prices. The difference would be taken by the state and poured into industrial construction. This policy severely damaged the interests of the peasants, and naturally, many of them resisted. Some refused to hand over grain. Others resisted the state's procurement system altogether. Faced with this problem, Stalin pushed forward agricultural collectivization. Large numbers of peasants were forced into collective farms. Their land, livestock, and tools were brought under collective and state control. In theory, peasants could leave the collective farms, but in practice, they could not take with them the means of production that had once belonged to them. In this way, millions of peasants were tied to state-controlled collective farms, forced to accept the government's low purchase prices. Around 1929, resistance to collectivization became fierce. In that year alone, thousands of protests and rebellions broke out across the Soviet countryside. Peasants attacked Soviet officials, burned collective farms, and slaughtered their own livestock to prevent it from being taken by the state. Stalin responded by sending large numbers of party members into the countryside and launching the campaign to eliminate the kulaks as a class. During this period, huge numbers of people labeled as kulaks were deported to Siberia and other remote regions. But the problem was that the definition of a kulak was often extremely vague. A person could be labeled a kulak simply for owning a few animals, a few farming tools, or even just for opposing collectivization. The irony was that many of those targeted were also among the most experienced and productive farmers in the countryside. As fear spread, many peasants began slaughtering their animals and destroying their tools, hoping to avoid being classified as kulaks. The result was massive waste and a further blow to agricultural production. In order to extract enough resources for industrialization, the pressure placed on the peasantry became extraordinarily harsh. Those who failed to meet grain procurement quotas could be punished. Those accused of hiding grain could face severe sentences. These policies eventually contributed to one of the greatest tragedies in Soviet history, the famine of 1932 to 1933, in which Ukraine suffered especially severely. Ukraine had long been one of the Soviet Union's most important grain-producing regions, but during collectivization and the anti-kulak campaign, large numbers of Ukrainian peasants were deported or persecuted. Combined with bad weather and chaos in agricultural production, grain output began to decline. Yet Stalin did not lower the procurement targets in time. Instead, he believed that the shortage was caused by peasants hiding grain. Procurement teams were sent into the countryside, taking not only grain, but in many cases the peasants' last reserves of food and even seed grain. In the end, a combination of state policy, forced grain collection, and agricultural collapse produced a catastrophe. Millions of Soviet citizens died in the famine, and Ukrainian peasants endured particularly terrible suffering. But while the human cost of industrialization was enormous, the results were also astonishing. During the first five-year plan, the Soviet Union concentrated its resources on steel, coal, electricity, machine building, tractors, and the military-industrial sector. New factories, new mines, and entirely new industrial cities were built across the country. Soviet industrial output rose rapidly, and the scale of heavy industry expanded dramatically. And this is where one of the great contradictions of Soviet industrialization appears. Although the Soviet Union opposed capitalism in ideology, its industrialization was deeply connected to the technology of the capitalist West. Then came the Great Depression. As Western companies struggled to survive the economic crisis, many of them became willing to sell machines, equipment, and technical expertise to the Soviet Union. The Ford Motor Company helped the Soviet Union build its automobile industry. American engineers and architectural firms took part in the design of massive Soviet factories. Western engineers and skilled workers were also hired by the Soviet state and brought into Soviet industrial projects. In other words, while the capitalist world was trapped in economic crisis, the socialist Soviet Union used capitalist machinery, technology, and talent to accelerate its own industrialization. By the end of the second five-year plan, the Soviet Union had transformed itself from a relatively backward agricultural country into one of the world's leading industrial powers, second in the world and first in Europe. It can be said that the success of the five-year plans played a crucial role in the Soviet Union's later victory in the Second World War. Without industrialization, the Soviet Union may not have been able to produce enough tanks, aircraft, artillery, and ammunition. It may not have been able to withstand the enormous pressure of the German blitzkrieg, and if the Soviet Union had collapsed, the consequences for all of humanity could have been catastrophic. But the disasters brought by this industrialization were also immense. Countless peasants were deported, dispossessed, and starved. Ukrainian peasants in particular suffered unimaginable pain during collectivization and the famine. This became one of the deepest wounds in Soviet history. So how should we judge Stalin's industrialization? It turned the Soviet Union into an industrial power in an incredibly short period of time. It gave the country the material foundation it needed to resist Nazi Germany. But at the same time, it was built upon the suffering of countless ordinary people. It drove the state machine forward through coercion, fear, and famine. So what do you think of Stalin's road to industrialization? Should the speed of economic development come first, or should development never be built upon the massive sacrifice of ordinary people? Welcome to leave your thoughts in the comments.
Congratulations, Comrade Stalin! Under your leadership, the pace of our 5-year plan has been accelerated again!
But Comrade Stalin, I heard that famine has broken out again in Ukraine.
Don't bother me with such a trivial matter.